After the execution of Charles I on the 30th of January 1649, his lying for public view, it was not a lying in state, his embalming, his black and velvet covered coffin was removed from St James's Palace on Parliament's orders to Windsor Castle, where it was to be buried out of the way in St George's Chapel. Parliamentary forces had captured Windsor Castle at the outbreak of the English Civil War, and the castle was held by Parliament for the whole of the war and was used by Cromwell at times as a base and a prison for royalist prisoners, and Charles himself had been held prisoner there for some time. St George's Chapel was a rather forlorn place in February 1649 when Charles I was buried there, as iconoclastic and destructive soldiers had attacked it. The Dean of Windsor, the head of the College of St George that ran the chapel in the early 1640s, was Christopher Wren, the father of Sir Christopher Wren, the architect. And when Parliament took the castle, the parliamentary commander, Captain Fogg, demanded from Dr Wren the keys to the chapel, threatening to pull down the chapel about Wren's ears. And Fogg's men broke into the chapel and plundered the treasury. They had also by this point ransacked the royal apartments. In April of 1643, Dean Wren and the canons of St George's were all expelled from their houses by the governor of the castle, Colonel Venn, under an ordinance of Parliament for the seizing of lands of papists, bishops, deans, chapters and notorious delinquents, and in so doing the chapel was effectively closed down. In December 1643, the House of Commons directed the governor to remove all scandalous monuments and pictures from the chapel. The gold plate, some dating back to the Middle Ages, was melted down for coin. Many items of great historic value, such as the heraldic surcoat of Edward IV, were destroyed. The woodwork was torn up and the organ and the stained glass windows smashed. Lead was stripped from the roof and the 15th century chapter house demolished. Dean Wren, before he left, was able to save some of the chapel records and the records of the Order of the Garter, but many more valuable archives were destroyed. So by the time the coffin of King Charles I was brought to St George's Chapel, the chapel had lain unused for nearly 6 years, and you have to imagine the king's coffin being brought into a semi-derelict and almost ruinous building with smashed glass on the floors and leaking roofs. It was not the finely restored building it is today. The sources differ on how discreet Charles I's funeral was, though there are two sources to draw on. One of these is Edward Hyde, Lord Clarendon's History of the Rebellion and Civil Wars in England. This is a contemporary source written by Clarendon very close to the events, though it was only actually published in 1702. The second source is by Anthony Wood, an Oxford antiquary, published in 1721. Wood was himself 17 at the time of the events, and he relied on eyewitnesses for his source material. Clarendon says that Parliament had agreed that the king should be buried at Windsor and in a decent manner, but that the whole affair should not cost more than £500. Parliament were of the view that the funeral should be quiet and private and without pomp and noise, but permission was given for the 4 gentlemen of the King's bedchamber, the Duke of Richmond, the Marquess of Hertford and the Earls of Lindsey and Southampton, to be present when the King was buried. They were not allowed to accompany the King's coffin to Windsor, and instead the King was accompanied by the 4 servants who had looked after him in his final days. According to Wood, the King's coffin was taken to Windsor in a black velvet-coloured car behind 6 black horses. Clarendon relates that when the coffin arrived, it was first placed in the King's old bedchamber before being removed on the day of the burial to St George's Hall when the 4 lords had arrived. Wood agrees, though he also says that the coffin first rested in the Dean's residence. The choice of the King's burial place, both Clarendon and Wood agree, was made on the day of the burial. Wood says that the old tomb house at the east end of St George's Chapel was first considered as a possible place for burial, and then the burial vault of Edward IV beside the high altar was explored as a possibility too. Clarendon says that St George's Chapel was so altered and transformed by the work of parliamentary soldiers that it was difficult for anybody to get their bearings. In the end, an old man from Windsor town came to point out where the vault of King Henry VIII was, in the very centre of the choir, the vault in which the bodies of Henry and his Queen Jane Seymour were buried. Wood differs and says that one of the lords was tapping his stick on the floor of the choir and heard a hollow resonance, and that is how the vault of Henry VIII was discovered. However the vault was discovered, it was decided that this would be the last resting place of King Charles I. Both Clarendon and Wood agree that a plate was affixed to the coffin. Clarendon says it was silver, Wood that it was lead, and that all that was written on it were the words King Charles 1648. Now this is a little confusing for us in the 21st century, for by our reckoning the king died in January of 1649, not in 1648. But at that time in history the new year began on Lady Day, the 25th of March, and so by 17th century reckoning Charles I died in January of 1648. Wood's account of all these proceedings is much more flowery than Clarendon's, and it is evident that he is beginning to craft a martyr's hagiography, and he describes an event at the funeral that Clarendon doesn't even mention. He says that as the king's coffin was brought out of St George's Hall in the upper ward of the castle, the sky overhead was clear and bright, but as the coffin reached the west steps of St George's Chapel, the steps that Her late Majesty's coffin were taken up, a snowstorm started, and the black velvet funeral pall covering the coffin was covered with a thick white layer of snow, the colour of innocency. Now Clarendon in his account tells us that the four lords had requested that Bishop Juxon, who was also present, should read the Book of Common Prayer burial service over the king's coffin. Both sources are clear that Colonel Widgecart, who was then the governor of the castle, flatly refused this, so that Charles was lowered into King Henry VIII's burial vault, as Wood says, without any words or other ceremonies except for the tears and sighs of a few beholders. After his coffin was lowered into the grave, the black funeral pall that was covering it was thrown on top. And there Charles I still lies with Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, Henry's beloved queen. With the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, it seemed that Charles II initially had bigger fish to fry than to provide a decent monument to his father, and he left Charles I's body where it was to lie in peace. He did, more or less immediately, order the restoration of St George's Chapel. Sadly, Dean Wren had died in 1658, but a new dean and canons returned, and a worshipping life once more resumed in the chapel. Those who signed the death warrant of Charles I, the regicides, were in many cases not left in peace. Oliver Cromwell, when he died in 1658, was buried in Westminster Abbey, yards away from Charles I's father, King James I. John Bradshaw, who had chaired the High Court that tried Charles, died in 1659, and he too had been buried in Westminster Abbey. And in January of 1661, both of their bodies were exhumed by order of Charles II, and on the 30th of January 1661, the anniversary of his father's execution, Charles had them taken to Tyburn, hanged, and then beheaded. Between 1660 and 1662, many of the men who had signed the king's death warrant also received the death sentence, and others received life imprisonment. In the later 1670s, Charles II did begin to turn his thoughts to erecting a proper and fitting memorial to his father at Windsor. On the 30th of January 1678, the 19th anniversary of Charles I's execution, Parliament voted the sum of £70,000 towards a solemn funeral for Charles I and for the erection of a monument to the said Prince of glorious memory. Glorious memory, how times had changed. Parliament, of course, didn't have the money. The money was to be raised through a tax on shipbuilding. The intention was to create a new mausoleum for Charles I, which was to be sited at the east end of St George's Chapel, where the present Albert Memorial Chapel now is. This was one of the locations suggested for Charles's initial burial and was occupied by an incomplete chapel constructed by Henry VII and then taken over by Cardinal Wolsey for his tomb, and known colloquially as the Tomb House. Sir Christopher Wren, the son of the late Dean, who knew Windsor intimately and had spent some of his childhood living in the deanery, was employed to design this new mausoleum, which, had it ever been constructed, would have been one of the most striking examples of Baroque classicism in England. Wren's designs for the mausoleum still survive in his archive at All Souls College, Oxford, and we can get a clear sense of both his intentions and the inspiration for the work. Wren's proposal was to create a domed rotunda on the site of the tomb house with a burial vault below to contain the king's coffin. In its basic form, if not in its details, the mausoleum emulates an early 16th century building in Rome, the Tempietto by Donato Bramante, in the courtyard beside San Pietro Montorio, a building that was commissioned in 1502 by Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. He drew on other buildings as source material for the other structural and decorative elements of the design. The Temple of Vesta in Rome inspired the Corinthian colonnade around the bottom of the rotunda. The swags between the columns were inspired by those on the tomb of Cecilia Metella on the Via Appia. The reference for the dome was Michelangelo's dome on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, designed in the 1540s. The interior space would have been spectacular. There was to be an internal dome lit from above, and the interior walls were to be decorated with a colonnade of engaged Corinthian columns, and the entablature supporting the internal dome was to be supported on 4 pairs of massive Corinthian columns. The centrepiece of the mausoleum was a monument to King Charles I, set in a vast niche on one wall, and Grinling Gibbons, one of the leading sculptors of the time, was commissioned to produce 2 designs for this in both stone and bronze and marble. The conception of the design was not subtle. Both designs incorporated a full-length figure of the king in armour, standing on a shield supported in turn by 4 figures of the heroic virtues: justice, temperance, prudence and fortitude. These were to stand on a block which was to be made of black marble, and under the block, crushed between it and the plinth of black marble, were to be 4 more figures representing religiously heretical and anti-monarchical vices. Envy was represented by an old woman with shrivelled breasts who was trying to grab Prudence's spear. Heresy was shown as a Puritan, hypocrisy as a figure who just removed a mask, while rebellion, armed and defiant, was shown lunging upwards towards fortitude. Above all this action and turmoil was to be Charles's serene, crowned and armoured effigy. He was to be portrayed looking innocently upwards with his hands raised, and above him there were to be winged putti appearing from the clouds, bringing down a wreath of victory to crown him. There are echoes here of Rubens' ceiling painting in the banqueting house of his father James I. Sadly, this great monument and mausoleum would never materialise, as the political situation simply changed. The political crisis that began later in 1678 with the Popish plot and the succession crisis that followed just put the kibosh on the whole scheme. And so Charles I still lies where he was left in 1649, in Henry VIII's vault. This burial vault was opened in 1813 and the king's coffin was seen, and a record of what was found was made by Sir Henry Holford, the king's physician, who would go on to publish his account in 1831. The vault was broken into rather accidentally. Now, you may have watched my video on the Georgian Royal Vault at Windsor. The last time I looked, it had 3.3 million views. The final phase of the construction of this vault was the completion of a long passageway that connected the entrance of the vault to a shaft that enabled coffins to descend from a point in the chapel floor before the high altar. We saw that shaft in use during the funeral of Elizabeth II, when her coffin descended through the floor at the very end of her funeral. While this passageway and shaft has been constructed, the workers accidentally broke through the wall of Henry VIII's vault, and 4 coffins were seen within, 3 of adults, 1 covered with a black velvet pall, the 4th the coffin of a child placed on top of the palled coffin. Here's a drawing of what was seen. On informing the Prince Regent of this, he then ordered the vault to be opened on the 1st of April 1813, and he was present at the opening with his brother the Duke of Cumberland, with his nephew the Earl of Munster, along with the Dean and a select group of men including Holford. When the pall-covered coffin was examined, it was found to be of lead, once enclosed in wood, and it bore an inscription on a leaden scroll, as described by Clarendon and Wood, King Charles, 1648. A square opening was then cut through the lead towards the top of the coffin so that the king's remains could be examined, and inside the lead shell was found, not unexpectedly, an inner wooden coffin. Charles's remains were found within that to have been embalmed in the usual manner. The body had been wrapped in cerecloth, waxed cloth, and some sort of resin had been applied to it too. When this covering was drawn back, the assembled company were able to gaze on the face of King Charles I. Holford says, and this drawing made at the time bears out, that the king's head was very well preserved. The skin was dark and discoloured, but the forehead and the temples of the king still had muscular substance. His nose cartilage had gone, but his left eye, which was open, remained for just a moment intact before turning to dust with the introduction of air into the vault. The king's beard was still attached to his chin, and many of his teeth remained. The question they all wanted to answer was whether the king's head had been reattached to his body when he was embalmed, and it seemed not, for the head was loose. The head was then taken up from the coffin and examined further. It was still moist, the scalp was perfect, and the king was seen to have a good head of hair. They looked very carefully for signs of the king's execution, which were quite visible. The muscles of the neck had retracted, but the fourth cervical vertebra was cut in half from the action of the axe, leaving the surface of the two portions of the vertebra smooth and even. Samples of the king's beard and his hair were taken by Sir Henry Holford, and these remain. Some years after the event, the hair, still in the royal collection, was placed in a beautiful 17th century style locket. The king's head was replaced in his coffin, and the coffin was soldered up, and there Charles still lies below the pavement of the choir of St George's Chapel, Windsor. Once unmarked, the position of the vault and the names of its royal occupants are now inscribed on a black ledger slab covering it, provided by King William IV. Thanks very much for watching.